March 17th, 1983. 2:14 a.m. Apartment 4B, Kaliningrad, Soviet Union. The telephone's ring cut through the darkness like a knife through silk. Not the standard Soviet-issue ring. 3 short bursts that everyone in Kaliningrad knew meant official business. But a single, sustained tone that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. 15-year-old Anya Volkov had been awake anyway, studying for her mathematics examination by the light of a single candle. The power had been out for 3 hours. Something about maintenance at the naval facility, though everyone knew the real reason. Fuel shortages that the party newspapers never mentioned. Her father wasn't home. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, Deputy Director of Signals Intelligence for the Baltic Fleet, had left 6 hours earlier wearing his dress uniform, the one with the medals he never explained. Her mother had gone to bed at 10, exhausted from her shift at the textile factory. The apartment smelled of black bread and the cheap tobacco her father smoked, mixed with the salt air that seeped through every crack in the concrete building 3 kilometers from the sea. Anya stared at the phone. It sat on a small table in the hallway. A heavy black Bakelite model that connected to a line her father had installed himself, separate from the standard residential system. She'd been told never to answer it, never even to touch it. The phone rang again, that same sustained tone, and Anya felt her throat tighten. Through the thin walls, she could hear the Petrenko family's television, a sign their power had returned. The candle on her desk flickered, casting shadows that made the phone seem to pulse with each ring. She reached for it. Later, she would never be able to explain why. Perhaps it was the certainty that her father was in trouble. Perhaps it was simply the fundamental human inability to let a ringing phone go unanswered. Her hand closed around the cold receiver, and she lifted it to her ear. "Strella," a man's voice said in Russian, using the word for arrow. Not a question. A statement. A code word. Anya's mouth went dry. I'm not... The line went dead. Not a click. Not static. Just an absolute, terrifying silence, as if the connection had never existed at all. She stood in the hallway, the receiver still pressed to her ear, as the power suddenly returned. The overhead light blazed to life, harsh and fluorescent, revealing her reflection in the dark window. A thin girl in a cotton nightgown, holding a telephone she should never have touched, staring at her own frightened face. She didn't know it then, but in that moment, she had just confirmed something that 6 different intelligence agencies had spent 18 months trying to verify. And in doing so, she had set in motion a sequence of events that would end with 3 deaths, 1 defection, and the exposure of the most sophisticated communications intercept operation in Cold War history. The telephone sat silent in its cradle. Outside, in the darkness beyond her reflection, a car's headlights swept across the building's facade and continued down the street without stopping. But somewhere in that darkness, someone was already making another phone call, and another, each one propagating through networks that stretched from Kaliningrad to Moscow to a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia, where it was still yesterday afternoon and a junior analyst was about to ruin his weekend. The official story, as it would appear in carefully sanitized CIA documents declassified in 2008, was straightforward. Operation Strella was a joint NSA-CIA signals intelligence program designed to intercept Soviet naval communications in the Baltic region. Launched in late 1981, it represented a significant technical achievement, utilizing a submarine-mounted array of hydrophones to capture underwater acoustic signals from Soviet communications cables that ran along the Baltic seabed. The program had been compromised in March 1983 by unknown means, resulting in its immediate termination and the emergency extraction of associated assets. What this bland summary failed to capture was the sheer audacity of what the United States had accomplished, and the equally audacious Soviet counterintelligence operation that had been tracking it for over a year. The genesis of Strella lay in a discovery made in 1979 by Commander James Holloway, a Navy cryptologist stationed at the NSA's European facility in Bad Aibling, West Germany. Holloway had been analyzing patterns in Soviet naval communications traffic when he noticed something peculiar. At certain times, particularly during bad weather that disrupted satellite communications, the Baltic Fleet would shift to a backup system that produced an unusual electromagnetic signature. After 6 months of analysis, Holloway concluded that the Soviets had laid a series of hardened communications cables along the Baltic seabed, connecting Kaliningrad to Leningrad and Moscow. These cables, protected by both physical armor and electronic countermeasures, represented a communications channel that the United States had never successfully penetrated. The problem was access. The Baltic was essentially a Soviet lake, heavily patrolled by surface vessels and submarines, monitored by coastal radar stations, and crisscrossed by acoustic sensors, designed to detect exactly the kind of intrusion Holloway was proposing. Any attempt to tap these cables using conventional methods, the submarine deployed induction devices that had worked so well against Soviet underwater cables in the Sea of Okhotsk, would be detected almost immediately. The Baltic Fleet wasn't the Pacific Fleet. It was smaller, more concentrated, and paranoid to the point of neurosis about NATO surveillance. Holloway's solution came from an unlikely source: commercial fishing technology. In 1980, a Norwegian company had developed a new type of deep-sea trawling equipment that used acoustic imaging to map the ocean floor in real time, allowing fishermen to avoid snagging their nets on underwater obstacles. Holloway realized that the same technology could be used to locate Soviet cables without actually touching them. More importantly, if you knew exactly where the cables were, you could position a passive listening device in the water column directly above them, using the cable's own electromagnetic emissions to power the device while simultaneously intercepting their signals. By September 1981, after 18 months of development funded through a black budget line item buried in the Navy's Oceanographic Research Program, the system was ready. The device itself was designated AN-WLQ-17. Though within the small group cleared for the operation, it was known simply as the ear. It was a cylinder approximately 2 meters long and 40 centimeters in diameter, containing a sophisticated array of induction coils, signal processors, and a burst transmission system that could compress 6 hours of intercepted communications into a 30-second transmission package. The ear was designed to be deployed from a submarine, would sink to a predetermined depth using ballast weights, and would remain suspended in the water column by a carefully calibrated buoyancy system. Every 72 hours, it would rise to just below the surface and transmit its accumulated data to a satellite passing overhead, then sink back to its operating depth. Battery life: 18 months. Detection probability, according to NSA analysts, less than 2%. The submarine chosen for the deployment was USS Halibut, SSN 587, a vessel that had earned legendary status within the intelligence community for its role in previous cable tapping operations. On November 12, 1981, operating under the cover of a routine NATO exercise, Halibut entered the Baltic through the Danish Straits and spent 11 days mapping Soviet cable routes. On November 23rd, at 0347 hours, at a position approximately 28 kilometers northeast of Kaliningrad, the first ear was deployed. Over the next 6 months, 7 more would follow, creating a network of listening posts that covered every major Soviet naval communications route in the Baltic. The intelligence haul was extraordinary. By March 1982, Strella intercepts had provided complete details on Soviet submarine patrol patterns, the location of previously unknown underwater sensor arrays, and most significantly, the communications protocols used by the Baltic Fleet's strategic submarine force, the vessels that would launch nuclear missiles against Western Europe in the event of war. CIA analysts estimated that Strella had provided intelligence equivalent to having a human source in the inner circle of Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy. But in Moscow, in a soundproofed office on the 3rd floor of the aquarium, the GRU's headquarters complex in northeastern Moscow, a colonel named Yevgeny Petrov was beginning to suspect that something was wrong. Petrov headed Department 12 of the GRU's 3rd Directorate, the unit responsible for protecting Soviet military communications from foreign intelligence penetration. He was 43 years old, a graduate of the Frunze Military Academy, and possessed the kind of methodical, suspicious mind that made him excellent at his job and intolerable at dinner parties. In July 1982, he had been reviewing routine security reports from the Baltic Fleet when he noticed a pattern. 8 separate incidents over the past 9 months in which sonar operators had reported brief, unexplained acoustic contacts in deep water, contacts that appeared and disappeared too quickly for the tracking computers to classify them as submarines or surface vessels. The incidents were spread across a wide area, but when Petrov plotted them on a map, they formed a rough arc along known cable routes. Each incident had occurred during the brief window when an American satellite with known signals intelligence capabilities was passing overhead. The probability of coincidence, Petrov calculated, was less than 1 in 10,000. On September 3, 1982, Petrov presented his findings to Lieutenant General Dmitry Ivanovich Ryzhkov, head of the GRU's 3rd Directorate. Ryzhkov listened to the presentation in silence, studying the map with its marked acoustic contacts and satellite pass times. When Petrov finished, Ryzhkov asked a single question. If you're correct, what should we do about it? Petrov's answer would define everything that followed. Instead of recommending an immediate search for the American devices, a search that would alert the CIA that the operation had been discovered, he proposed something far more sophisticated. Let the devices continue operating, but feed them carefully crafted disinformation, while simultaneously using them to identify the American agents and technical systems involved in the operation. It was a counterintelligence officer's dream. Turn the enemy's greatest success into their greatest vulnerability. Ryzhkov approved the operation immediately. It was designated Zerkalo, mirror, and its objective was not simply to neutralize Strella, but to map the entire CIA infrastructure that supported it, from the agents who had provided intelligence on Soviet cable routes to the satellite systems that received the intercepted data. And at the center of this operation, carefully cultivated, though he didn't yet know it, was Colonel Dmitry Volkov. Volkov was exactly the kind of officer who made counterintelligence officers nervous, competent, ambitious, and just disillusioned enough to be vulnerable to recruitment. He had joined the Navy in 1963, survived the brutal hazing that characterized Soviet military service, and risen through the signals intelligence ranks through a combination of technical expertise and political savvy. By 1982, at age 41, he was Deputy Director of the Baltic Fleet's Signals Intelligence Division, with access to cable routing information, communications protocols, and fleet movement schedules. Exactly the kind of information that would be useful to an intelligence service trying to tap Soviet underwater cables. He was also exactly the kind of officer the GRU would choose if they wanted to feed disinformation to the Americans. In October 1982, acting on orders from Moscow that he didn't fully understand, Volkov began receiving unusual assignments. Prepare detailed reports on cable maintenance schedules, update routing diagrams that would normally be handled by junior officers, participate in security reviews that seemed to focus on technical details rather than personnel vulnerabilities. He executed these assignments efficiently, as he did everything, and filed the resulting documents in the secure safe in his apartment, the one connected to the special telephone that rang at odd hours with authentication codes he was required to confirm. What Volkov didn't know was that every document he handled had been subtly modified. The cable routing diagrams were accurate, but they included information about backup cables that didn't exist. The maintenance schedules were real, but they incorporated additional maintenance windows that the Navy had no intention of executing. The communications protocols were genuine, but they included outdated cipher keys that the GRU had already replaced. And every piece of this corrupted information was stored in places where a CIA technical penetration, a listening device in his apartment, for instance, might discover it. Because the GRU's working theory, supported by months of analysis, was that the Americans had found a way to penetrate Soviet communications without requiring a human source. They had technical access, not human access, and that meant they were vulnerable in ways that traditional espionage operations were not. Find the technical systems, map their architecture, and you could feed them poison without them ever knowing they'd been compromised. The special telephone in Volkov's apartment was part of the test. It was connected to a secure line that ran directly to Baltic Fleet headquarters, encrypted with current cipher protocols, and theoretically immune to any form of technical surveillance. But if the Americans really had developed a capability to tap underwater cables, then they might have also developed capabilities to penetrate other forms of hardened communications infrastructure. The phone was bait, and the authentication codes that Volkov confirmed were the cheese in the trap. By March 1983, the GRU was convinced they had identified the full scope of Strella. They knew approximately where the listening devices were located, though finding them in the Baltic's murky waters remained difficult. They had identified 3 satellites that appeared to be receiving burst transmissions. They had traced modifications to the USS Halibut's hull that suggested a dedicated deployment capability. What they still didn't know was how the CIA was getting intelligence out of the devices they'd deployed. The satellites were clearly part of it, but there had to be a backup system, some way to retrieve data if the satellite link failed or was jammed. The answer came from an unexpected source. Colonel Volkov's 15-year-old daughter, who on March 17, 1983, at 2:14 in the morning, picked up a telephone she'd been told never to touch and spoke to someone who said one word: Strella. The call had originated from a hotel room in Warsaw, though the man who placed it had no connection to Poland beyond the geographic accident of his current location. His name was Viktor Pavlovich Rusakov, and officially he worked as a trade representative for Export Kleb, the Soviet grain export agency. Unofficially, he was a lieutenant colonel in the GRU, assigned to Department 12's operational support section, which meant his job was to handle the technical logistics of counterintelligence operations that required international coordination. Rusakov had been in Warsaw for 3 days, attending meetings that had nothing to do with grain exports and everything to do with coordinating Zerkalo's endgame. The plan, as briefed to him by Colonel Petrov in Moscow, was elegant in its simplicity. On the night of March 16th to 17th, the GRU would conduct a series of coordinated tests designed to force the CIA to respond in ways that would reveal their operational infrastructure. Test 1. Transmit an emergency authentication code to Colonel Volkov's special telephone at an unusual hour, 2:14 a.m., when any response would have to be abnormal, either because Volkov himself answered, suggesting he'd been alerted to expect the call, or because the line was monitored by technical means that would record the code. The code word was Strella, a deliberate provocation, using the very designation the GRU believed the CIA had assigned to the operation. If the Americans were listening, they would understand immediately that their operation had been compromised. The question was how they would respond. Would they try to extract their listening devices? Would they activate emergency communications protocols? Would they attempt to warn any human sources they might have in the Baltic Fleet? Each response would reveal something about their capabilities and their network architecture. Rusakov had placed the call at exactly 2:14 a.m. Warsaw time, which was 3:14 a.m. in Kaliningrad. The phone had rung 6 times before someone answered. A female voice, young, confused. Definitely not Colonel Volkov. Rusakov had delivered the code word and hung up immediately, exactly as instructed. Then he had placed a second call, this one to a secure number in Moscow, reporting that Test 1 had been executed and that an unknown female had answered. In Moscow, receiving the report at 4:17 a.m., Colonel Petrov felt a satisfaction that was almost physical. An unknown female answering the phone meant one of 2 things. Either Colonel Volkov had been so thoroughly compromised that the CIA had placed a handler in his apartment, or, far more likely, the phone line itself was being monitored by technical means, and someone at a monitoring station had answered reflexively when they heard the authentication prompt. Either way, it confirmed that the Americans had technical access to what was supposed to be one of the most secure communication systems in the Baltic Fleet. Petrov immediately initiated Test 2. At exactly 0430 hours, the Baltic Fleet would transmit a flash precedence message through its underwater cable network, reporting a fictional emergency involving a submarine collision near the Swedish coast. This message, crafted carefully to seem urgent and genuine, contained specific technical details that existed nowhere in actual Soviet operational plans. If the Americans had really tapped the underwater cables, they would intercept this message, and if they believed it was genuine, they would respond, perhaps by alerting Swedish authorities, perhaps by repositioning their own submarines, perhaps by initiating diplomatic inquiries. The GRU had monitoring systems in place to detect any of these responses. But in Kaliningrad, in apartment 4B, Anya Volkov was experiencing a different kind of test, one that hadn't been planned by anyone. After hanging up the phone, she had stood frozen in the hallway for perhaps 30 seconds, her mind racing through possibilities. Her father had told her never to answer the special phone. She had just answered the special phone. The man on the other end had used a code word. Code words meant intelligence work, which meant her father's real job, the one he never discussed, the one that explained his irregular hours and his occasional trips to Moscow. She had just compromised something, she realized with a clarity that made her stomach lurch. She didn't know what, but she knew the word for arrow, Strella, and she knew her father's work involved signals intelligence, and she understood that the two facts together meant she had just done something catastrophically wrong. Her first instinct was to wake her mother. Her second, which prevailed, was to wait until her father came home. She returned to her desk, but studying was impossible. She sat in the glow of the overhead light, which had remained on after the power returned, and watched the clock. 2:47 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 3:42 a.m. At 4:18 a.m., she heard a car engine outside. She went to the window and saw her father's assigned Volga pulling into the building's small parking area. He got out, still wearing his dress uniform, and walked toward the building entrance with the measured pace of a man who is either very tired or very worried. Anya met him at the apartment door. "Papa, I need to tell you something." Colonel Dmitry Volkov looked at his daughter's face and felt his stomach drop. He had been an intelligence officer for 20 years. He could read fear, and he could read guilt, and he could read both in his daughter's expression. What happened? The phone rang. The special phone. I answered it. The color drained from Volkov's face. When? About 2 hours ago, 2:14. There was a man. He said one word, Strella, and then hung up. Volkov's mind, trained for decades to process information under pressure, suddenly felt like it was moving through concrete. The special phone. An authentication code at 2:14 a.m. His daughter's voice on the line instead of his own. And now he was home at 4:18 a.m., having left fleet headquarters at 3:45 after receiving urgent orders to report for duty at 0600 for reasons that hadn't been explained. The coincidence was impossible. The implications were terrifying. He walked past Anya to the hallway, picked up the receiver of the special phone, and listened. The line was dead, not disconnected, but silent in a way that suggested it had been deliberately terminated. He replaced the receiver and stood very still, thinking. If this was an authentication test, then someone was checking to see if his secure line was compromised. If someone was checking, then someone suspected. If someone suspected, then his next actions in the next few hours would determine whether he ended up with a promotion or a bullet in the basement of the aquarium. "Anya," he said quietly, "go wake your mother. Pack a bag. Just essentials. Enough for a few days. Do it quietly. Can you do that?" "Papa, what's happening?" "I don't know yet, but I need you to trust me. Pack a bag. Be ready to leave in 10 minutes. What Dmitry Volkov couldn't know, standing in his hallway at 4:19 a.m. on March 17, 1983, was that his next decision had already been foreclosed by events taking place 7,000 kilometers away, where it was still 8:19 p.m. on March 16th, and a CIA analyst named Robert Chen was having what he would later describe as the worst evening of his life. Chen worked in the office of SIGINT Operations, a division of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, and his job was to monitor satellite downlink data from various technical collection platforms. On the evening of March 16th, he had drawn the overnight shift, which meant sitting in a windowless room at CIA headquarters, watching data streams on a series of monitors, looking for anomalies. It was tedious work, the kind of job that required just enough attention to prevent sleep, but not enough to stay truly engaged. Chen had a master's degree in electrical engineering from MIT and had imagined, when he joined the agency 3 years earlier, that he would be doing something more interesting than watching numbers scroll past on a screen. At 8:23 p.m., one of the numbers changed in a way that made Chen suddenly very alert. The monitor displayed telemetry from KH-11 satellite designated Kennen 4, one of the birds that provided downlink reception for Strella's burst transmissions. The telemetry showed that Kennen 4 had just received a burst transmission, which was normal. The ears transmitted on a 72-hour cycle, and several transmissions were due. What wasn't normal was the transmission duration, 37 seconds, when the standard duration was 28 to 32 seconds depending on data volume. Chen pulled up the detailed log. The transmission had originated from the ear-designated Strella 3, located approximately 30 kilometers northeast of Kaliningrad. The extended transmission length suggested either a larger than normal data volume or a transmission error. Chen initiated the standard verification protocol. Request a retransmission from Strella 3's backup system. The backup system was designed to store the last 10 transmission cycles, allowing for recovery if the primary transmission failed or was corrupted. The retransmission request went out at 8:26 p.m. By 8:41 p.m., when there had been no response, Chen was starting to worry. By 8:56 p.m., when the backup system still hadn't responded, he called his supervisor at home. Thomas Brennan had been with the agency for 19 years, long enough to know that when a junior analyst called you at home on a Wednesday night, it was never good news. He listened to Chen's report, asked 3 specific technical questions, and told Chen he'd be there in 20 minutes. Then he hung up and called William Crawford, the Assistant Deputy Director for SIGINT Operations, at his home in McLean. Crawford had been at a dinner party. He excused himself, took the call in his host's study, and listened to Brennan's briefing with a growing sense of dread. Strella was one of the agency's crown jewels, a collection platform that had cost $70 million to develop and deploy, and was providing intelligence that the Director of Central Intelligence briefed personally to the President every month. If Strella had been compromised, if the Soviets had discovered the ears, then the agency was about to lose not just a collection capability, but also the months of intelligence that capability had provided. Because if the Soviets knew about the ears, then everything the ears had collected might be disinformation. "Do we have any indication the Soviets know?" Crawford asked. "No, sir," Brennan said. "But the timing is suspicious. We've been receiving good intelligence from Strella 3 for 16 months. Now suddenly the backup system won't respond. Either there's a technical failure, which seems unlikely given the redundancy we built in, or someone has physically accessed the device. How long until Kennen 4 is back in position for another pass?" 96 minutes. "All right. I want full diagnostics on Strella 3 during the next pass. If we can't establish contact, I want you to assume the worst and initiate the emergency protocol." The emergency protocol was outlined in a sealed document stored in Crawford's personal safe at Langley. It specified procedures for securing or destroying compromised technical collection platforms, evacuating any associated human, sources, and sanitizing any paper trails that might lead back to the operational details. Implementing it would effectively terminate Strella and result in the loss of approximately $100 million in deployed assets, the 7 ears that remained operational, the specialized satellite receivers, the submarines that had been modified for deployment operations. But Crawford's real concern wasn't the money or even the lost intelligence. It was the question of how the Soviets had discovered Strella and what else they might have discovered in the process. Because if they had found the ears through technical means, by detecting their electromagnetic emissions or their satellite transmissions, then the compromise was limited to Strella itself. But if they had found the ears through human intelligence, through an agent who had provided information about the operation, then the compromise might extend to other programs, other operations, other secrets that the agency couldn't afford to lose. At 9:17 p.m. on March 16, 1983, William Crawford drove through the gates of CIA headquarters, badged through 3 security checkpoints, and took the elevator to the 5th floor, where the Office of SIGINT Operations maintained its operations center. He found Robert Chen and Thomas Brennan huddled around a bank of monitors, reviewing telemetry data that Crawford couldn't interpret but could read in their body language. Something was very wrong. "Show me," Crawford said. Brennan brought up a series of graphs showing transmission data from Strella 3 over the past 6 months. The pattern was regular, consistent, exactly what you'd expect from an automated system operating on a fixed schedule. Then he overlaid the data from tonight's transmission. The waveform was subtly different, not dramatically so, but enough that the comparison software had flagged it as anomalous. "This could be a transmission under duress," Brennan said. "The device has a tamper detection system. If someone tries to physically access it, the system is supposed to wipe its memory and broadcast an alert. But if someone was very good, very careful, they might be able to access the device without triggering the tamper detection. In that case, the device would continue transmitting, but the signal characteristics might change slightly because of the physical intrusion." Are you telling me the Russians found one of our ears and are now using it to feed us disinformation? I'm telling you it's a possibility. The other possibility is a technical malfunction that happens to have produced an anomalous signal. But given that the backup system also isn't responding, Crawford made the decision that would define his career. Initiate the emergency protocol. I want all Strella assets secured or destroyed within 72 hours. Start with Strella 3. If the Russians have it, I want it at the bottom of the Baltic, where they can't learn anything useful from it. Then evacuate any human sources associated with the operation. Do we have any active human sources in the Baltic fleet? No, sir. Strella was designed as a purely technical operation. We didn't want any human sources in play that might compromise the technical systems. Good. Then our exposure is limited. Execute the protocol. At 9:43 p.m. Eastern Time on March 16, 1983, which was 4:43 a.m. on March 17th in Kaliningrad, an encrypted message was transmitted from CIA headquarters to the USS Halibut, which was currently operating in international waters approximately 200 kilometers northwest of Gdansk. The message, designated Flash Precedence, contained a single operational directive. Proceed to designated position, Strella 3. Deploy recovery package. Alpha. Confirm destruction of asset. The recovery package Alpha was a carefully engineered device that the Navy had never particularly wanted to deploy. It was essentially a shaped charge designed to be lowered from a submarine to the ocean floor, positioned next to a target, and detonated remotely. The charge would destroy anything in its immediate vicinity, while producing an explosion signature that resembled a natural seismic event or a mine detonation. Something that could plausibly be explained as a Cold War-era military accident, rather than a deliberate sabotage operation. The captain of the Halibut, Commander James Wheeler, received the message at 4:51 a.m. local time and spent the next 7 minutes reviewing it with his executive officer, trying to understand what could possibly have justified a flash precedence order to destroy an intelligence asset that had been providing excellent intelligence for 16 months. But orders were orders, and Wheeler had been in the submarine service long enough to understand that the decision-makers in Washington sometimes knew things that operational commanders didn't. At 5:02 a.m., Halibut changed course and began heading southeast toward the coordinates designated Strella 3. In Kaliningrad, Colonel Dmitry Volkov was loading his family into his Volga, having made a decision that would change his life, but might save it. His wife, confused and frightened, sat in the passenger seat with a hastily packed bag. Anya sat in the back, watching her father's face in the rearview mirror, seeing something there she'd never seen before. Fear. Not the controlled concern of a military officer managing a crisis, but genuine, visceral fear. Volkov started the car and pulled out of the parking area, heading not toward fleet headquarters, where he was due in 90 minutes, but toward the coast road that led west, toward the Polish border. He had made the calculation that any intelligence officer eventually makes when the walls start closing in. Is this a test, or is this the end? If it was a test, if someone was checking his loyalty, his responses, his reliability, then running would be a fatal mistake. But if it was the end, if he had been compromised, if his secure line had been penetrated, if his daughter's voice answering the authentication prompt had confirmed suspicions that were already in place, then staying would be equally fatal, just slower and more painful. The calculation came down to the phone call. Why would someone call his secure line at 2:14 a.m. with an authentication code that Volkov hadn't been briefed to expect? Either it was a test of the line's security, which meant someone already suspected penetration, or it was a routine authentication check that had gone to the wrong number. But Volkov had been in signals intelligence long enough to know that nothing about secure authentication protocols was routine, and nothing went to the wrong number by accident. He drove west, watching the rearview mirror for headlights that might be following. His wife asked him once, "Dmitri, where are we going?" And he said, "Warsaw." And she didn't ask again because she understood what that meant. Warsaw was Poland, and Poland was outside the Soviet Union, and leaving the Soviet Union without authorization was defection, and defection meant they could never come home. At 5:23 a.m., Colonel Yevgeny Petrov in Moscow received a report that made him smile for the first time in 72 hours. Colonel Dmitry Volkov had failed to report for duty and appeared to have left Kaliningrad with his family. The implications were obvious. Volkov had been compromised, had been warned somehow that he was compromised, and was now running. This wasn't proof that Volkov was a CIA agent. He might simply have panicked when his daughter answered the phone, but it was sufficient confirmation that Zerkalo had been successful in identifying a security breach. Petrov immediately ordered KGB border guards to apprehend Volkov if he attempted to cross into Poland, though he suspected the order would arrive too late. Volkov had a 90-minute head start, and a man with his training would know exactly how to use it. More importantly, Petrov ordered the immediate seizure of Volkov's apartment, his office, and his personal effects. If Volkov had been working with the CIA, there would be evidence, and if there was evidence, Petrov would find it. What Petrov didn't know, wouldn't know for another 6 hours, was that there was no evidence to find because Dmitry Volkov had never been a CIA agent. He had never been recruited, never been contacted, never been offered money or ideology or blackmail. He was simply a conscientious officer who had executed the assignments given to him by his superiors, assignments that had been carefully designed by those same superiors to appear suspicious to American intelligence. Volkov was, in the truest sense, a pawn who had just realized he was on a chessboard where the moves made no sense, and the only winning strategy was to stop playing. The USS Halibut reached the designated coordinates at 7:34 a.m. local time on March 17th. The sea conditions were moderate, 2-meter swells, visibility approximately 3 kilometers, wind from the northwest at 15 knots. Commander Wheeler ordered the submarine to periscope depth and conducted a visual sweep of the horizon. Nothing. No surface vessels, no aircraft, no indication that anyone was paying attention to this particular patch of the Baltic Sea. "Take us down to 200 meters, Wheeler ordered. "Deploy the ROV. The remotely operated vehicle, a small unmanned submersible equipped with cameras and manipulator arms, launched from a specialized bay in the Halibut's hull at 7:47 a.m. It descended through the dark water, its lights cutting through the murk, searching for the ear-designated Strella 3. The device was supposed to be at a depth of 85 meters, suspended in the water column approximately 12 meters above the seabed cable it was monitoring. At 8:02 a.m., the ROV's sonar detected an object at the expected coordinates. The camera feed, displayed on monitors in Halibut's control room, showed what appeared to be the ear, hanging in the water exactly as designed. But something was wrong. The device's external housing appeared to be intact, but there was an unusual amount of sediment around its base, as if it had been resting on the seabed rather than floating in the water column. "Bring us in closer," Wheeler said. The ROV approached cautiously. At a distance of 5 meters, the camera revealed the problem. The ear's buoyancy system had failed. The device was sitting on the seabed, not floating as designed. But that didn't explain the anomalous transmission, and it didn't explain why the backup system hadn't responded. "Can we recover it?" Wheeler asked his executive officer. "Not without a significant delay, sir. We'd need to deploy the full recovery system, and that's a 12-hour operation even under ideal conditions. Our orders are to destroy it." Wheeler nodded slowly. He had been in command long enough to know when to follow orders and when to question them, and this felt like one of those edge cases where either choice could be defended. But flash precedents meant someone in Washington thought this was urgent, and Wheeler's instinct, honed by 20 years in submarines, was that when intelligence types got nervous, you didn't argue. "Deploy the charge," he said. "Set it for 15-minute delay. I want us out of here before it goes off." At 8:17 a.m., the ROV placed a 20-kilogram shaped charge approximately 2 meters from Strella 3 and activated its timer. At 8:23 a.m., the Halibut was at a depth of 300 meters and heading northwest at 12 knots. At 8:32 a.m., the charge detonated with a force equivalent to approximately 15 kilograms of TNT. The explosion destroyed Strella 3 completely, shattered the Soviet communications cable it had been monitoring, and sent a pressure wave through the water that was detected by acoustic sensors from Kaliningrad to Stockholm. In Kaliningrad, at the Baltic Fleet's acoustic monitoring station, a young sonar operator named Mikhail Fedorov was analyzing the acoustic signature when he realized something peculiar. The explosion had occurred almost exactly at the coordinates where Colonel Petrov's analysis had predicted one of the American listening devices might be located. Fedorov immediately called his supervisor, who called the fleet intelligence officer, who called Moscow. And within 90 minutes, Colonel Petrov was reviewing the acoustic data with the satisfaction of a man who has just seen his theory confirmed by experimental evidence. The Americans, realizing their operation had been compromised, had just destroyed their own intelligence device, rather than let it fall into Soviet hands, which meant Zerkalo had been successful, which meant the next step was to exploit that success by identifying the other listening devices, and more importantly, by understanding how the Americans had deployed them in the first place. But there was a problem, one that Petrov wouldn't fully understand for another week. The Americans hadn't just destroyed Strella 3. Over the next 48 hours, they systematically destroyed all 7 ears, turning their $100 million intelligence triumph into 7 piles of twisted metal scattered across the Baltic seabed. And with each destruction, Petrov's satisfaction began to curdle into something more complex. Because if the Americans were willing to destroy their entire network that quickly, that completely, then they weren't just cutting their losses. They were panicking. And if they were panicking, it meant they thought the compromise was worse than it actually was. It meant they didn't understand that Zerkalo had been a controlled operation, that the GRU had been feeding them disinformation rather than simply discovering their devices. It meant the CIA thought they had a human source problem rather than a technical security problem. And that meant someone at the CIA was about to start looking for a mole who didn't exist. The search for the non-existent mole began on March 19, 1983, in a conference room on the 6th floor of CIA headquarters. William Crawford had assembled his senior staff, 8 men and 2 women, all with top-secret code word clearances, all with decades of combined experience in signals intelligence operations. On the conference table, lay a stack of folders containing the complete operational history of Strella, from Holloway's initial analysis in 1979 through the emergency protocol executed 72 hours earlier. "Gentlemen, ladies," Crawford began, "we have a problem. Strella is gone. 7 collection devices, destroyed on our own orders. The question is how the Soviets discovered them. The answer to that question will determine whether we have a technical security problem or a human security problem. And if it's a human security problem, it will determine who in this organization gets investigated for espionage." The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone present understood the implications. A technical security problem meant the Soviets had discovered Strella through their own capabilities. Improved sonar, better signal detection, lucky accident. A technical security problem was embarrassing and expensive, but it didn't mean anyone in the room was a traitor. A human security problem meant someone had told the Soviets about Strella, either deliberately or through careless operational security. A human security problem meant polygraph examinations, FBI investigations, and careers destroyed. "Let's review what we know," Crawford continued. "On the night of March 16th to 17th, we detected an anomalous transmission from Strella 3. The transmission was longer than normal, and the waveform characteristics suggested possible tampering. The device's backup system failed to respond to our retransmission request. Based on this evidence, I ordered the implementation of the emergency protocol." Was the emergency protocol justified? The question came from Patricia Huang, who ran the technical analysis division and had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. "Yes," Crawford said flatly. "The protocol specifies that if we detect evidence of possible compromise, we secure or destroy the asset immediately. That's exactly what we did." "But do we have evidence of actual compromise or just evidence of a technical anomaly?" Crawford pulled a photograph from one of the folders and slid it across the table. "This is a satellite image from March 18th, showing Soviet naval activity in the Baltic. Notice the unusual concentration of vessels in the areas where we deployed our collection devices. Notice particularly the presence of specialized recovery ships, vessels equipped for deep water salvage operations. The Soviets are looking for something, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they're looking in exactly the areas where we had our ears deployed." Another photograph joined the first. This is from March 19th. Notice the search pattern has expanded. They're being systematic about it. This isn't a routine exercise. This is a deliberate search operation, which means they know something is down there. "Or they think something is down there," Huang said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Crawford leaned forward. "Let me posit a scenario. The Soviets discover Strella through technical means. Improved sonar, better signal detection, whatever. They locate one or more of our ears, but they don't recover them immediately. Instead, they watch to see how we respond. When we destroy the devices, they learn about our emergency protocols. When we pull back our submarines, they learn about our deployment capabilities. They turn our security measures into an intelligence collection opportunity." "That's a sophisticated response," said James Mallory, who ran the Soviet analysis division. "It suggests they've been tracking Strella for longer than just a few days. It suggests they may have known about the operation for months and have been using it for counterintelligence purposes." The implications of Mallory's observation settled over the room like a fog. If the Soviets had known about Strella for months, then every piece of intelligence the operation had collected during that time was potentially compromised. The submarine patrol patterns, the communications protocols, the fleet movement schedules, all of it might have been carefully crafted disinformation designed to mislead American intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions. "We need to review every piece of intelligence Strella provided," Crawford said. "Compare it to other sources. Look for inconsistencies, anomalies, anything that suggests we were being fed false information. And we need to determine how the Soviets discovered the operation in the first place." This was where the meeting became uncomfortable, because there were only 3 ways the Soviets could have discovered Strella: technical penetration, operational mistake, or human betrayal. Technical penetration meant the Soviets had developed capabilities the CIA didn't know about. Operational mistake meant someone in the room or in the operational chain had made an error that had exposed the program. Human betrayal meant someone with access to Strella had deliberately told the Soviets about it. Let's start with technical penetration, Crawford said. Is it possible the Soviets detected our ears through their own capabilities? The discussion that followed was detailed, technical, and ultimately inconclusive. Yes, it was possible the Soviets could have detected the electromagnetic emissions from the ears, but unlikely given the sophisticated shielding. Yes, it was possible they could have detected the satellite burst transmissions, but the transmissions were encrypted and would have required sophisticated direction-finding equipment to locate. Yes, it was possible they could have detected the ears through acoustic means, but the devices were designed to be acoustically silent. Possible, but unlikely, which left operational mistake or human betrayal. Who knew about Strella? Crawford asked. Huang consulted an access list. At the operational level, approximately 40 people. At the briefing level, approximately 300. At the need-to-know level, approximately 1,200. Narrow it down. Who knew the specific coordinates where the ears were deployed? Approximately 20 people. The submarine crews who deployed them, the mission planners who selected the locations, the analysts who reviewed the intelligence they provided. Start with those 20, Crawford said. I want complete background investigations, financial records, travel histories, personal associations. I want to know if any of them have had contact with Soviet intelligence officers, wittingly or unwittingly. I want to know if any of them have financial problems, personal problems, ideological problems. I want to know everything. What Crawford didn't know, couldn't know, was that the investigation he was ordering would find nothing, because there was nothing to find. None of the 20 people with access to Strella's operational details had betrayed the program because the program hadn't been betrayed. It had been discovered through exactly the kind of methodical technical analysis that the CIA itself would have conducted if their positions had been reversed. But the absence of evidence wouldn't stop the investigation. It would only make it more intense, more paranoid, more destructive. Because an intelligence organization that believes it has been penetrated but cannot find the penetration will eventually conclude that the penetration is so sophisticated, so well hidden, that extraordinary measures are required to find it. And extraordinary measures in the world of counterintelligence meant assuming everyone was guilty until proven innocent, which meant no one could ever be fully proven innocent. The search for the mole who didn't exist would consume the Office of SIGINT Operations for the next 18 months, would result in the forced retirement of 7 officers, would destroy 3 marriages, and would ultimately accomplish nothing except to confirm Colonel Petrov's initial assessment. The Americans had no human source in the Baltic Fleet, only technical capabilities that had now been neutralized. On March 21st, Young Chasharso, 1983, at approximately 3:30 p.m., Colonel Dmitry Volkov walked into the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw and requested political asylum. He was accompanied by his wife and daughter, all of them exhausted from 2 days of traveling on back roads, sleeping in the car, and subsisting on whatever food they could buy without attracting attention. The Marine Guard at the embassy entrance made a phone call, and within 15 minutes, Volkov was sitting across a desk from a CIA officer who introduced himself as David Brenner and said he was very interested in hearing Volkov's story. The debriefing took 6 hours. Volkov explained his position in the Baltic Fleet, his work in signals intelligence, his suspicions about why his apartment had a special secure telephone, his daughter's inadvertent answer to a call that had used what he believed was an authentication code. He explained his calculation that the call had been a test, that he had failed the test, and that running was his only chance at survival. Brenner listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions that Volkov found surprisingly sophisticated. At the end of the debriefing, Brenner made a phone call and had a conversation in English that Volkov couldn't follow. Then Brenner hung up and looked at Volkov with an expression that was difficult to read. "Colonel Volkov," Brenner said in Russian, "I need to ask you a direct question. and I need you to answer it honestly. Have you ever provided information about Soviet military operations to any foreign intelligence service? No, Volkov said. Never. Have you ever been approached by anyone who tried to recruit you as an intelligence source? No. Have you ever had access to information about American intelligence operations in the Baltic region? Only what I could infer from my work. Signal patterns, unusual communications activity. Nothing specific. Brenner was silent for a moment. Then he said, I believe you, Colonel, but I need to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear. The U.S. government will grant you and your family political asylum. We'll provide you with new identities, financial support, and protection. But you need to understand that from the Soviet perspective, your defection will be seen as confirmation that you were working with us. They will assume you were a CIA agent, even though you weren't. They will use your defection as proof that their counterintelligence operation was successful. What counterintelligence operation? That's what we're trying to understand. But based on your description of events, it appears the GRU was running a controlled operation, possibly to identify technical surveillance capabilities, possibly to feed disinformation. The phone call to your apartment may have been a test, exactly as you suspected, but not a test of your loyalty. A test of whether your secure communications line had been penetrated by technical means. Volkov felt something cold settle in his stomach, so my daughter answering the phone may have confirmed what they were already suspecting. I'm sorry. And now I've defected, which confirms it further. Yes. Volkov looked at his hands, which were trembling slightly. 20 years in the Soviet Navy, a career built on loyalty and competence, now ending in defection, because his daughter had answered a telephone. The irony was so bitter, it was almost funny. What happens to me now? He asked. We'll fly you to the United States. There's a facility where we conduct debriefings of Soviet defectors. It's in Virginia, near Washington. You'll spend several months there, maybe longer, answering questions about your work, your knowledge of Soviet communication systems, anything that might be useful. After that, we'll help you resettle somewhere safe. And my family? They'll be with you throughout the process. We take care of our defectors, Colonel Volkov. What Brenner didn't say, because he had been instructed not to, was that the CIA's interest in Volkov had nothing to do with his technical knowledge, and everything to do with what his defection revealed about Strella's compromise. Volkov's description of the special telephone, the authentication code, and his daughter's response provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The Soviets had been testing to see if Volkov's secure communications line had been penetrated, which meant they suspected technical surveillance, but didn't know its full extent. This information, when it reached William Crawford at CIA headquarters 3 days later, produced a reevaluation of the entire Strella compromise. If the Soviets had been testing for technical penetration rather than investigating human betrayal, then maybe the intelligence Strella had collected before March 1983 was genuine after all. Maybe the emergency protocol had been implemented too hastily. Maybe destroying 7 ears worth $100 million had been a mistake born of excessive caution and insufficient analysis. Or maybe it had been exactly the right decision, and Volkov's defection was itself part of a sophisticated GRU disinformation operation designed to make the CIA think Strella had been discovered technically rather than through human intelligence. In the paranoid logic of counterintelligence, every piece of information confirmed both the hypothesis and its opposite, and the only certainty was that certainty itself was impossible. The mole hunt continued. Volkov was debriefed extensively, his every statement analyzed for signs of deception or manipulation. His daughter's testimony about the phone call was reviewed repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies. His wife, who knew nothing about his work and had simply trusted her husband when he said they needed to leave, was questioned for hours about their marriage, their finances, their social connections. And through it all, the question remained unanswered. How had the Soviets discovered Strella? Was it Volkov? Was it someone else in the Baltic Fleet? Was it a technical breakthrough? Was it simply bad luck? A Soviet sonar operator who happened to be in the right place at the right time? The truth, as Colonel Petrov could have explained but never would, was that it had been none of these things. It had been methodical analysis, careful observation, and the kind of patient counterintelligence work that produced results not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the accumulation of small pieces of evidence that, taken together, revealed a pattern. Petrov had looked at acoustic anomalies and satellite passes and cable maintenance schedules, and he had seen what others had missed. The United States had developed a capability to tap underwater cables in the Baltic Sea. The fact that he had then used that discovery to feed disinformation to the Americans, rather than immediately neutralizing their collection devices, was simply good operational practice. Why settle for denying your enemy intelligence when you could provide them with carefully crafted false intelligence instead? Why settle for closing a window when you could use that window to show them a room that didn't exist? The declassification of Strella-related documents began in 2008, 25 years after the operation's termination. The documents appeared in heavily redacted form, released in response to Freedom of Information Act requests from researchers studying Cold War intelligence operations. The official summaries, written by CIA historians, told a straightforward story: an ambitious technical intelligence operation, compromised by unknown means, terminated appropriately through emergency protocols. What the official summaries didn't include was the human cost. 7 intelligence officers forced into early retirement under clouds of suspicion that were never officially stated, but were clearly understood by everyone involved. 12 marriages that ended in divorce, the stress of polygraph examinations, and background investigations, proving too much for relationships that were already strained by the secrecy requirements of intelligence work. 1 suicide, though the official records listed it as an accident, and a family living under assumed names in a small town in Vermont, where the father worked as a translator for a defense contractor and never quite lost the habit of checking his rearview mirror for cars that might be following, where the mother adapted to American life with remarkable grace, while never quite forgiving her husband for the decision that had taken them from their home, and where the daughter grew up knowing that she was the reason for everything that had happened, that a single decision at 2:14 a.m. on a March morning had changed the course of 3 lives, and in some small but irreversible way, the course of history. Anya Volkov, now Anna Walters, would eventually become a professor of Russian history at a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. She would write a dissertation on Soviet signals intelligence, would publish 2 well-regarded books on Cold War espionage, and would never tell her colleagues or students that her interest in the subject was anything other than academic. She would marry a man who worked in banking, would have 2 children, and would live what everyone who knew her considered a normal, successful American life. But she would never quite forget the weight of that telephone receiver in her hand. The sound of a stranger's voice saying a single word, Strella, and the knowledge that she had just answered a question she didn't understand, with an answer that turned out to be catastrophically correct. The technical lessons from Strella were incorporated into subsequent operations. The ears were redesigned with better security features, more robust tamper detection, and improved communications protocols. The deployment procedures were revised to minimize the time submarines spent in potentially hostile waters. The satellite systems were upgraded to provide faster data transmission and better encryption. But the human lessons, the understanding that technical operations could be discovered through methodical analysis, that operational security was only as good as its weakest link, that sometimes the right decision produced catastrophic consequences, while the wrong decision might have produced better outcomes. These lessons were harder to incorporate. They lived in the institutional memory of the intelligence community, passed down through oral tradition and bitter experience, shaping the calculations that future operations officers would make when they faced their own moments of decision. In Moscow, Colonel Yevgeny Petrov was promoted to brigadier general and appointed deputy director of the GRU's 3rd Directorate. He would serve in that position for another 9 years, overseeing counterintelligence operations that would become the subject of speculation and analysis long after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. In 1993, 2 years after the USSR's collapse, Petrov would retire to a dacha outside Moscow, where he would spend his remaining years gardening, writing unpublishable memoirs, and occasionally receiving visits from former colleagues who wanted to hear his stories about the old days. He would die in 2002, at age 63, of a heart attack that his doctors said was probably related to the stress of his career, though stress was a difficult thing to measure in retrospect. At his funeral, attended by perhaps 40 people, a former colleague would give a eulogy that praised Petrov's dedication, his analytical brilliance, and his understanding that intelligence work was ultimately about patience and precision rather than drama and adventure. What the eulogy wouldn't mention was Zerkalo, which remained classified in Russian archives and would likely remain so for decades to come. What it wouldn't mention was the satisfaction Petrov had felt when acoustic sensors detected the destruction of Strella 3, confirmation that his analysis had been correct. What it wouldn't mention was the more complex satisfaction he had felt when Colonel Dmitry Volkov defected, because Volkov's defection meant the Americans thought they had a human intelligence problem when they really only had a technical intelligence problem, which meant they would waste resources investigating the wrong thing. Intelligence work, Petrov had often told his subordinates, was like chess. The goal wasn't necessarily to capture your opponent's pieces, but to make your opponent believe they were losing pieces they actually hadn't lost, or winning pieces that weren't actually worth winning. The goal was to shape your opponent's understanding of the board in ways that led them to make mistakes that seemed reasonable at the time, but were catastrophic in retrospect. The phone call to Colonel Volkov's apartment at 2:14 a.m. on March 17, 1983, had been one move in a larger game. The fact that Volkov's daughter had answered it had been an unexpected complication that had turned into an unexpected advantage. The fact that Volkov had then defected had been a bonus, an unintended consequence that had amplified the operation's success beyond what Petrov had originally planned. But the most successful aspect of Zerkalo, the part that Petrov was most proud of, was something that would never be fully understood by American intelligence analysts. For 18 months before March 1983, the GRU had been carefully feeding genuine intelligence through the channels that Strella was monitoring, building confidence in the operation, making it seem like an invaluable source. Then, in the weeks immediately before the operation's planned exposure, they had begun mixing in carefully crafted disinformation, false submarine patrol patterns, fictional weapon systems, imaginary strategic plans. The Americans, having lost confidence in Strella after its compromise, would spend years trying to determine which intelligence had been genuine and which had been false. They would analyze every piece of intelligence the operation had provided, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, confirmations from other sources. And in doing so, they would never quite trust any intelligence source as completely as they had trusted Strella, because they would never quite know whether they were being played again. This was the real victory of Zerkalo, not the exposure of Strella itself, but the damage to American confidence in their technical intelligence capabilities. The lesson that even the most sophisticated technical systems could be discovered and exploited. The understanding that in the secret world of intelligence operations, nothing was ever quite what it seemed, and the only certainty was that certainty itself was dangerous. In a small town in Vermont, on a cold evening in March 2008, Anna Walters opened her email and found a message from a colleague at Yale who specialized in Soviet intelligence history. The message contained an attachment, a declassified CIA document about an operation called Strella. Anna opened the document and began reading, and with each page, she felt something tighten in her chest. The document was heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out, but enough remained to tell the story. An operation to tap Soviet underwater communications cables in the Baltic Sea, compromised in March 1983 through unknown means, terminated through emergency protocols. There was a reference to a defection, a Baltic Fleet signals officer who had sought asylum in Warsaw, though the officer's name was redacted. There was a reference to an investigation that had examined whether the operation had been betrayed by human intelligence, though the investigation's conclusions were redacted. There was a reference to lessons learned and procedural changes, though the specific lessons and changes were redacted. Anna sat at her desk, reading and rereading the document, trying to reconcile this official account with her memory of that night in March 1983. A telephone ringing, a man's voice, a single word, her father's face when he realized what she had done. The drive through the darkness toward the Polish border, her mother crying quietly in the front seat. Anna herself numb with the understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The document made it seem clean, bureaucratic, inevitable. Technical operation, unknown compromise, appropriate termination. But Anna remembered the human cost. Her father's career destroyed. Her mother's depression that had lasted for years. Her own sense of guilt that had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand even now, 25 years later. She wondered if the people who had written this document, who had reduced her family's catastrophe to a few sanitized paragraphs in a CIA history, understood what they were really describing. She wondered if they knew that behind every redacted paragraph was a human story, a moment of fear or doubt or courage or simple bad luck that had changed lives in irreversible ways. She wondered if her father, wherever he had died 3 years earlier. A stroke at age 67, his last years spent in quiet retirement with her mother in the Vermont house they had bought with CIA resettlement money. She wondered if he had ever known whether his decision to run had been right or wrong, whether staying would have been better or worse, whether there had been any way to navigate the situation that wouldn't have ended in disaster. Anna closed the document and sat in the darkness of her office, listening to the sound of snow falling outside her window. Somewhere in Russia, she knew, there were documents that told the same story from the other side. Documents that would probably never be declassified. Documents that might explain whether her father had been right to run or whether he had played into exactly the narrative that someone in Moscow had wanted him to play into. But knowing wouldn't change anything. History, she had learned from years of studying it, was not a story with clear villains and heroes, with right decisions and wrong decisions. History was a series of choices made by people who didn't have enough information, didn't have enough time, and couldn't possibly have known what consequences their choices would produce. All you could do was make the best decision you could, with the information you had, and then live with the consequences. Her father had made his decision at 4:19 a.m. on March 17, 1983, standing in the hallway of his apartment in Kaliningrad, holding a telephone that his daughter should never have answered. And whatever he had chosen, to stay, to run, to try to explain, to try to hide, would have been wrong in some way, right in another, justified by some standards and condemned by others. The only certainty was that a 15-year-old girl had answered a telephone at 2:14 in the morning, and in doing so had triggered events that neither she nor her father nor anyone else could have fully controlled, and that sometimes history turned on moments that small, on decisions that innocent, on consequences that disproportionate to the actions that caused them. Anna turned off her computer, gathered her papers, and prepared to go home to her husband and children, to her American life, to the existence she had built on the ruins of the life that had ended that March night in Kaliningrad. The document would be filed away, would become part of the historical record, would be cited by researchers and students trying to understand the Cold War's secret history. But the human story, the story of a girl and a telephone and a decision that changed everything, that story would remain locked in the memories of the few people who had lived it. A story that could never be fully declassified because it contained truths that were too personal, too painful, too complicated to fit into the sanitized language of official histories. In the end, that was the real secret. not the technical details of Strella or Zerkalo, not the operational procedures or the communications protocols, but the simple fact that behind every intelligence operation, every compromise, every defection, there were human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and living with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. The snow continued to fall outside Anna's office window, covering the small Vermont town in a blanket of white that made everything seem clean and new and innocent. But beneath the snow, Anna knew, the ground was still frozen, still waiting for spring, still holding in its soil all the buried things that would never quite disappear, no matter how much time passed or how much snow fell. She locked her office door and walked out into the cold night, where her car was waiting to take her home. And somewhere in the darkness, a telephone was ringing that no one would answer, because some calls, once made, could never be unmade, and some consequences, once triggered, could never be recalled.